Deep in the unforgiving wilderness of the Cascade Mountains, death was only minutes away. Mason Reynolds, a seasoned outdoorsman with 30 years of mountain experience, lay trapped beneath fallen timber as the merciless blizzard buried him alive. His radio destroyed, his supplies scattered, and his body temperature plummeting dangerously, Mason had accepted his fate. Then came the sound, not of wind or wolves, but of something massive moving through the snow. Massive footprints, a towering silhouette, hands too large to be human. What happened in those next crucial hours would challenge everything Mason thought he knew about the natural world. Was saving this creature's secret worth sacrificing the discovery of a lifetime? The morning fog clung to the mountain slopes as Mason Reynolds carefully spread his topographic map across the hood of his weathered Jeep. His calloused fingers traced the familiar contours of the Cascade Range, following paths he'd marked over decades of expeditions. At 58, the creases around his eyes had deepened like the valleys on his map, each line earned through years of patient observation in the wilderness. "This time, old girl," he murmured to the mountains, "this time you'll share your secrets." Mason folded the map with practiced precision, tucking it into the special waterproof pocket of his pack. The map was more than paper and ink to him. It was a record of his life's work, with handwritten notes dating back 30 years, marking places where he'd captured award-winning wildlife photographs and others where he'd seen things he couldn't quite explain. He checked his satellite phone one last time. Enough for one final call. "Dad, please reconsider." His daughter's voice crackled through the speaker. "The Weather Service issued alerts for that region." "Emily, I've been watching these patterns longer than those meteorologists have been alive," Mason said, softening his tone. He knew her concern came from love, even if it chafed against his independence. "Besides, I've got enough supplies for a month. I'll be out before the real weather hits. That's what you said last time, and search and rescue had to—" "That was different," Mason interrupted, the memory of that failed expedition still a tender spot. "I've got something special this trip. The migration patterns have shifted. There are species moving through these valleys that haven't been documented." The silence that followed spoke volumes. They both knew what remained unsaid, that since Clara's death 3 years ago, Mason's expeditions had grown longer, more frequent, and increasingly remote. "Dad," Emily's voice softened. "Mom wouldn't want you risking yourself like this." Mason's throat tightened. "Your mother understood why I do this." He gazed up at the mountain peaks emerging from the morning mist. "There's something up there, Em, something important, more important than coming back to us, than being there for Lily's birthday next month." Mason closed his eyes, visualizing his 7-year-old granddaughter. "I'll be there, promise, with pictures that'll make her science project the talk of the school." After reluctant goodbyes and promises to check in when possible, Mason shouldered his pack. 60 pounds of carefully selected gear, his Nikon cameras, long-range lenses, emergency supplies, and enough food to last 3 weeks. Everything methodically packed and balanced for the long trek ahead. The first mile disappeared easily beneath his boots. Mason breathed deeply, the familiar scent of pine and damp earth filling his lungs. This was where he belonged, not in the sterile comfort of civilization with its noise and distractions, but here, where life followed rhythms unchanged for millennia. By midday, he reached the first landmark, a lightning-struck pine that marked the boundary where casual hikers turned back. Beyond this point, the trail faded and the true wilderness began. Mason paused to refill his water bottle from a crystal-clear stream and check his GPS coordinates against his map. The hairs on the back of his neck suddenly stood up. Mason froze, water bottle half filled. Years in the wilderness had honed his instincts to razor sharpness. Something was watching him. He slowly reached for his camera, movements deliberate and non-threatening. Through the viewfinder, he scanned the tree line, looking for the telltale movement of wildlife. Nothing, yet the sensation persisted. "Just passing through," he said aloud, his voice seeming unnaturally loud in the forest's hush. No harm intended. Speaking to animals was an old habit one Emily teased him about. But Mason had found that voice and intention mattered in the wild. Predators could sense fear and aggression. Whatever watched him now was assessing his purpose. As he continued his ascent, the feeling gradually subsided. But Mason remained alert, noting the unusual silence. No bird calls, no squirrels chattering. The forest was holding its breath. Late afternoon brought him to the first planned campsite, a small clearing sheltered by ancient cedars. As he set up his tent with practiced efficiency, Mason noticed something odd, a broken sapling at the edge of the clearing. The break wasn't natural. The wood had been twisted, not snapped by wind or weight of snow. Mason approached it cautiously. The break was fresh, sap still oozing, and it was high, nearly 8 feet off the ground. Too high for a bear standing on hind legs. Too deliberate for random damage. He photographed it carefully from multiple angles, then searched the soft ground nearby. That's when he found it. A partial footprint pressed into a patch of mud, large, much larger than his own size 12 boot, with 5 distinct toes. "Well," Mason whispered, excitement quickening his pulse as he took out his plaster casting materials. "Aren't you interesting?" Above him, clouds began to gather around the mountain peaks, earlier than forecasted. The first harbinger of the storm that would change everything. Dawn broke with a thin mist hanging between the trees as Mason carefully wrapped the plaster footprint cast in protective cloth. He tucked it into his pack with reverence. 13 inches long, with 5 distinct toes, and a depth that suggested remarkable weight. Not human, yet unnervingly humanoid. Not bear. The stride pattern he'd measured from the partial tracks ruled that out. "Remarkable," he murmured, allowing himself a moment of scientific excitement before tamping it down with practiced skepticism. Evidence required verification. One print could be a hoax, a misidentification, a rare deformity in a known species. He broke camp efficiently, leaving no trace of his presence except the removed casting material. The mountains demanded respect, and Mason had long ago learned to move through them as a guest, not an invader. By mid-morning, he'd climbed another 1,000 feet in elevation. The forest had changed subtly, older growth, less human interference. Mason paused frequently, photographing unusual moss formations and the tracks of elk that had passed through recently. But always, his eyes drifted to the tree line, searching. The first truly unusual sign appeared near a small stream where he stopped to refill his water. 3 saplings had been bent, not broken, and woven together in a pattern that couldn't possibly be natural. The craftsmanship was crude, but undeniably deliberate. Mason photographed it from multiple angles, including a reference shot with his hand in frame to show scale. Not teenagers, he reasoned aloud, a habit from years of solo expeditions. We're 15 miles from the nearest trail, and definitely not rangers. He'd known the local Forest Service personnel for decades. They had better things to do than trek this far to construct strange markers. As he followed the stream upward, the signs became more frequent. Rocks stacked in precise formations, more twisted saplings, and twice, unmistakable barefoot prints pressed into muddy sections, though none as clear as the first cast he'd made. By early afternoon, dark clouds had begun gathering over the higher peaks. Mason frowned, checking his barometer watch. Pressure dropping faster than forecasted. He'd need to find suitable shelter for the night sooner than planned. The radio crackled to life unexpectedly, startling a nearby jay into raucous complaint. Repeat. Advisory for all backcountry hikers and campers. Severe system moving in from the northwest, expected to hit the Central Cascades by tomorrow morning. Temperatures dropping to below freezing with heavy precipitation. Mason adjusted the frequency, trying to clear the static. This is Ranger Station Echo. Repeat. Severe weather advisory. The voice belonged to Chuck Dawson, an old acquaintance from Mason's early days as a wilderness guide. Mason pressed the transmit button. Echo Station. This is Mason Reynolds, currently at... He checked his GPS. 4732 north, 12144 west. Elevation approximately 5,200 feet over. Static crackled, then... Mason, that really you? What the hell are you doing up there with this system coming in? Routine wildlife documentation, Mason replied, omitting mention of the footprints and strange markers. Forecast showed I had 3 days before any serious weather. Forecast was wrong. Chuck's voice was grim. This thing accelerated overnight. We're pulling all the permitted hikers out of the backcountry. You need to descend immediately. Northeast route is your fastest way down. Mason glanced up at the gathering clouds, then at the ascending ridge where he'd planned to make his primary camp, where the signs had been leading him. Copy that, Chuck. I'll start making my way down. A lie delivered with the ease of long practice. Reynolds out. He switched off the radio and tucked it into his pack's side pocket. The smart move would be to heed the warning, make a quick descent to lower elevation. Mason had survived this long by respecting the mountains and their dangers. But the footprint cast pressed against his back through the canvas of his pack. The photos on his camera, the twisted saplings and stacked stones, all leading higher, deeper into the wilderness. Whatever was leaving these signs wouldn't be here when the weather cleared. Migrations happened within narrow windows. Opportunities missed rarely returned. Sorry, Chuck, Mason said to the silent radio. This one matters. He adjusted his pack and continued upward, pace quickening. If he pushed hard, he could reach the sheltered valley he'd marked on his map before dark. It offered natural protection from wind and precipitation, with a rock overhang that could serve as a windbreak for his tent. The wind picked up as the afternoon waned, carrying a biting chill that hadn't been present that morning. The birds had gone silent, and even the insects seemed to have retreated in anticipation of the coming storm. Only Mason moved against the mountain's warning, driven by decades of curiosity and the tantalizing possibility of documenting something science had dismissed as myth. As dusk approached, he caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of his vision, something large, moving with surprising grace between distant trees. When he turned his head for a direct look, nothing remained but swaying branches. Yet the distinct impression lingered that he'd been allowed this glimpse, that whatever watched him was growing bolder. And for the first time in 30 years of wilderness exploration, Mason Reynolds felt like prey being led into a trap. Mason reached the sheltered valley just as the last light faded from the sky. Wind whipped through the treetops with increasing ferocity, bending the tallest pines into creaking submission. He worked quickly, fingers nimble despite the dropping temperature. As he secured his tent beneath the protective overhang of a granite outcropping, the specialized weather alert device clipped to his pack emitted a shrill warning beep. Mason silenced it with practiced efficiency, already aware of what it would tell him. The barometric pressure was plummeting faster than anticipated. Temperature dropping. Precipitation imminent. Tell me something I don't know, he muttered, driving the final stake into the rocky ground. Inside the tent, Mason organized his gear with military precision. Cameras safely stowed in waterproof cases. Extra layers accessible. Emergency supplies within easy reach. The routine was comforting, a ritual performed countless times over decades in the wilderness. He activated his satellite tracking beacon, the concession he'd made to Emily after his last close call. It would ping his location to her phone app every 12 hours, showing he was still moving, still alive. Mason had disabled the emergency feature. The last thing he needed was an unnecessary rescue attempt if the coming storm interfered with the signal. His stomach growled, reminding him he'd eaten little since morning. Mason fired up his compact stove, brewing a pot of strong coffee to accompany a pouch of dehydrated stew. Outside, the first heavy drops of rain began to strike the tent fly with irregular percussion. The weather alert device beeped again, more insistently this time. Mason reluctantly checked the readout. The projected storm track had shifted, now centered directly over his position. Sustained winds of 50 miles per hour, with gusts potentially reaching 70. Rainfall expected to transition to heavy snow as the temperature continued to drop. He should leave now. Make a night descent using his headlamp. It would be treacherous, but potentially less dangerous than what tomorrow might bring. The device beeped a third time, an automated avalanche risk assessment based on the terrain, projected snowfall, and existing conditions. The display flashed red. High risk. Mason switched off the device completely, silencing its warnings. "Not tonight," he said firmly. Night navigation in these conditions was suicide. First light. "I'll head down at first light." The decision made, he focused on his meal and reviewing the day's photographs. The footprint cast sat beside him, its plaster now fully hardened. In the bright beam of his headlamp, the details were even more remarkable. Dermal ridges visible in sections, suggesting a foot without the hardened calluses one might expect from an animal moving barefoot through wilderness. The wind rose to a howl, tent walls flexing inward despite the sheltered position. Mason instinctively checked his guy lines through the tent door. Still secure, a sudden crack split the night, the distinctive sound of wood giving way under pressure. Mason grabbed his headlamp and unzipped the tent, scanning the perimeter. 20 yards upslope, an enormous pine had partially uprooted, its massive trunk leaning precariously, supported only by its neighbors. "Time to move," Mason muttered, quickly calculating the tree's potential fall path directly across his current position. Rain pelted his face as he hurriedly broke camp, cursing the storm's accelerating timeline. Within 15 minutes, he'd relocated to a position he judged safe from falling timber. Sacrificing the overhang's protection for distance from the hazardous tree, the new position left him more exposed to the elements. Rain had turned to sleet that rattled against the tent like thrown gravel. Inside, Mason changed into dry layers and zipped himself into his sub-zero sleeping bag. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees since sunset. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the storm's growing violence. Sometime after midnight, Mason woke to absolute stillness. The eye of the storm, he thought, or perhaps a brief respite before the system's second wave arrived. In that moment of unnatural quiet, he heard it, a low, sustained vocalization unlike anything in his extensive catalogue of wilderness sounds. Not wolf or mountain lion, not elk or bear. The call carried clearly through the thin nylon of his tent, emanating from somewhere upslope. It held for nearly 30 seconds before fading. Minutes later, an answering call came from the opposite direction. Lower in pitch, different timbre, unmistakably a response to the first. Mason fumbled for his digital recorder, hands shaking with a mixture of professional excitement and primal fear. Before he could activate it, the storm returned with redoubled fury. Snow now, thick and wet, already beginning to accumulate on the tent fly. His last thought before drifting back to uneasy sleep was that he'd made a terrible mistake. Not in staying despite the warnings, but in believing he was the hunter in this equation. Whatever roamed these slopes had been tracking him since he entered their territory. The footprints, the markers, they hadn't been random signs he'd happened upon. They'd been meant for him to find. Mason woke to a world transformed. 8 inches of wet snow had fallen during the night, with more coming down in thick, silent flakes. His tent sagged under the accumulation despite his periodic efforts to clear it. The temperature gauge on his watch read 27 degrees, a dangerous plummet from yesterday's 55. Mason's breath clouded as he fired up his small stove to melt snow for coffee, his mind calculating. The storm was still intensifying, visibility reduced to less than 50 yards. Navigation would be challenging, but descending now was his only safe option. He packed methodically, preserving the footprint cast with extra padding. The cameras went into his pack center, cushioned by clothing. Just as he prepared to break down the tent, his satellite phone chirped, a rare signal in these conditions. One new message. "Dad, where are you? Weather Service issued evacuation for your area. Please respond. Emily." Mason tried to compose a reply, but the signal dropped before he could send it. He'd have to get to lower elevation to establish communication. Outside, the snow had a strange quality, heavy and wet underneath, with a crust beginning to form on top from a slight warming. Dangerous avalanche conditions. Mason strapped on his snowshoes and tested the slope cautiously. His plan was simple: follow the natural contour down, staying on the least steep sections until he reached the old Forest Service road 5 miles below. From there, he could follow it to the ranger station. The first hour passed in grueling, careful progress. The snow deadened all sound except his labored breathing and the crunch of his snowshoes. Twice he paused to photograph the landscape, unable to resist documenting the pristine beauty despite the danger. Through his telephoto lens, he caught a dark shape moving along a distant ridge, too far to identify, but definitely large and bipedal. Mason's hands trembled as he changed to a longer lens. By the time he refocused, the figure had vanished. The incline steepened as he approached a section where the valley narrowed. Mason checked his map, confirming this was the most dangerous part of his descent, a natural funnel where snow could accumulate and release. He'd need to cross it quickly, then reach the relative safety of the tree line below. He was halfway across the exposed slope when he heard it, a sound like muffled thunder from above. Mason looked up to see a wave of white cascading down the mountainside, gathering speed and mass. "No, no, no," he whispered, instantly calculating his options. Too far from either side to reach safety. No shelter, no protection. His survival training kicked in. He released his pack straps, discarding the precious weight of cameras and equipment. His emergency avalanche airbag was his only chance, the device designed to help him float atop the snow rather than be buried beneath it. Mason yanked the activation cord as the first surge of snow hit him like a speeding truck. The bag deployed with a loud hiss, but it was already too late. The force spun him like a rag doll, disorienting him completely as he tumbled downslope. Something struck his head, a rock or chunk of ice, sending a burst of stars across his vision. Then darkness. Consciousness returned in fragments, cold, crushing pressure. The taste of blood. Mason realized he was partially buried, his right arm pinned completely, his legs immobilized by packed snow. His left arm had somehow remained free enough to move a few inches. The avalanche airbag had kept him from being buried completely, but had been punctured during the violent descent. Above him, through a small gap in the snow, he could see a patch of gray sky. How long had he been unconscious? Minutes, hours? Pain radiated from his right side. Possible broken ribs. His exposed left hand was already dangerously cold. Hypothermia would claim him long before starvation if he couldn't free himself. Mason tried to take inventory of his situation. His pack was gone. The satellite phone with it. No beacon, no radio. His pocket knife remained in his pants pocket, but he couldn't reach it with his free hand. A movement caught his eye. A massive fallen tree trunk lay diagonally across his position, partially sheltering him, but also pinning him more securely. The snow had shaped itself around this obstacle, creating the small air pocket that was keeping him alive. With painful effort, Mason managed to turn his head enough to see his camera, miraculously still attached to the strap around his neck, though the lens was cracked and the body dented. Using his free hand, he pulled it closer to his face. Perhaps his last message to Emily could be stored on its memory card if it still functioned. As he pressed the power button, the camera came to life, battery still operational. Mason awkwardly positioned it, trying to frame his own face in what might be his final self-portrait. As he did, he noticed something in the viewfinder, a blur of movement at the edge of the frame. Something large was moving through the snow toward him. Not a rescue worker, not another hiker. The massive silhouette paused, as if sensing it was being observed, then deliberately moved closer, its features becoming clearer against the white landscape. Mason's finger trembled as he pressed the shutter button one final time before darkness reclaimed him. Consciousness returned like a reluctant visitor. Mason's eyes fluttered open to diminishing light. How long had he been out? Hours, based on the fading glow filtering through his small air pocket. The temperature had dropped further. Each breath emerged as a crystalline cloud, hanging briefly before dissipating in the confined space. He couldn't feel his right arm anymore, a bad sign. His left hand, exposed to the elements, had taken on a waxy appearance. Early frostbite. The crushing pressure across his chest made each breath a labor. and a steady throb radiated from his right side, where he suspected broken ribs. Mason tried to shift his position, seeking any relief from the crushing weight. Useless. The fallen tree and compacted snow formed an immovable prison. His mouth was dry, lips cracked. Dehydration would accelerate hypothermia's effects. He awkwardly scooped a small handful of snow with his functioning hand and brought it to his mouth. The cold burned his cracked lips, but the moisture was welcome. His thoughts turned to Emily and little Lily. Would they find his body when the spring thaw came? Would the camera survive with its final image intact? The irony wasn't lost on Mason. After decades seeking evidence of mysterious creatures, he might have captured proof with his final photograph, only for it to remain buried with him until weather or scavengers erased all trace. From his jacket's inner pocket, Mason extracted a small waterproof notebook and pencil, his constant companions on expeditions. With stiff fingers, he began to write by the fading light. If you're reading this, I'm sorry. Not for being here, these mountains were always where I belonged, but for the worry I caused you. For missing birthdays and graduations while chasing the next horizon. Your mother understood this need in me. I hope someday you will too. Tell Lily her grandpa found something wonderful up here. Something science said couldn't exist. The cast is in my pack if it survived. The final photo on my camera shows what I saw approaching before I lost consciousness the second time. Not human, not animal, something in between. Mason paused, breathing becoming more difficult as the cold penetrated deeper. The margins of his vision darkened, narrowing his world further. He forced himself to continue, handwriting deteriorating. Don't let them turn it into a circus. No press conferences or expeditions. This place, these creatures, they've survived by remaining hidden. Respect that. Study the evidence privately first. I don't regret coming here. Every moment in these mountains was living, truly living. Remember me when you look at the high places, but don't grieve too long. I'm where I belong, all my love. Dad, the pencil slipped from his numbing fingers. Mason let his head rest back against the snow wall, conserving what little energy remained. The temperature would drop precipitously after sunset. Without shelter, fire, or dry clothing, the math was simple. He had hours at most. Strange how peaceful the realization felt. No panic, just calm acceptance. His mind drifted to Clara. Would she be waiting? His scientific rationality had never quite extinguished the hope of reunion. As darkness claimed the small air pocket completely, Mason's mind began to wander. The cold produced a curious euphoria, nature's final mercy. Hallucinations flickered at the edges of perception. Clara's voice calling from somewhere beyond the snow. Emily as a child, laughing as he taught her to skip stones across the lake near their cabin. His mother's kitchen, warm with the scent of baking bread. Time lost meaning. Had minutes passed or hours? The darkness was absolute now, but Mason no longer needed light to see the memories that played across his mind's eye. His breathing had slowed to shallow whispers. Soon it would stop altogether. A new sound penetrated his fading consciousness, not wind or settling snow, but something deliberate, rhythmic. The sound of impact against packed snow, growing closer. Mason tried to call out, but his voice emerged as barely a whisper. The impacts stopped directly above him. Snow shifted, pressure changing. Mason blinked, unsure if this too was hallucination. A section of his snow ceiling began to disintegrate, chunks falling away. Cold air, colder than his small pocket, rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and something else. Something musky and alive. Starlight appeared where solid white had been moments before. Mason stared upward, his fading vision struggling to process what loomed above. A massive silhouette blocked the stars, its breath visible in the frigid air. Enormous hands, covered in thick dark hair, reached down into the opening. The last of Mason's rational mind noted the opposable thumbs, the humanoid structure of the digits, even as they closed around his shoulders with surprising gentleness. Not real, Mason whispered. Certain now, this was death's final illusion. The creature made a sound, a low rumble that resonated in Mason's chest. not threatening, almost concerned. As he was carefully lifted from his icy tomb, Mason's consciousness finally surrendered completely. His last sensation was of being cradled against a massive chest, warmer than should be possible in the killing cold of the mountain night. Warmth, that was Mason's first conscious sensation. Impossible warmth enveloping his frozen body. Then movement, a steady rocking motion punctuated by the crunch of footsteps in deep snow. His mind struggled to process these contradictions. He should be dead, frozen in his snowy tomb. Instead, he was moving through the blizzard. Mason forced his eyes open. Darkness, but not complete. Moonlight reflected off snow, creating an ethereal blue-white glow that illuminated the landscape in shadowless relief. He was being carried. Strong arms held him against a broad chest, generating heat that seemed to defy the sub-zero temperatures. When Mason tilted his head back, his breath caught. The face above him belonged in no scientific journal or wildlife guide. Massive brow ridge, deep-set eyes reflecting amber in the moonlight, a flat, wide nose, facial structure unmistakably primate, yet unlike any known species. The creature's entire body was covered in thick, dark hair, not fur, but something more like human hair, longer in some places, particularly around the face and shoulders. Fear surged through Mason's veins, a primal response to finding himself in the grasp of something his brain categorized as impossible. He struggled weakly, a reflexive action he immediately regretted as pain lanced through his injured ribs. The creature stopped, looking down at him, those eyes intelligent, assessing. No aggression, only what Mason could only interpret as concern. It made a soft sound, somewhere between a rumble and a purr, clearly meant to be reassuring. "What are you?" Mason whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. The creature adjusted its grip, cradling Mason more securely as it resumed walking. Each stride covered impressive distance through the deep snow. No snowshoes, Mason noted with professional curiosity cutting through his fear. The creature's feet were massive enough to distribute its weight naturally. They climbed steadily through the storm, following a route invisible to Mason's eyes. The creature moved with the confidence of intimate familiarity, navigating by landmarks obscured by snow and darkness. Twice it paused, lifting its head to emit a low, sustained vocalization, similar to what Mason had heard before the avalanche, but softer. A signal, perhaps. Mason's pack, somehow recovered from the avalanche debris, hung from the creature's free hand. The torn straps had been crudely knotted together in a repair that demonstrated both dexterity and problem-solving intelligence. Mason's scientific mind catalogued these observations automatically, even as exhaustion threatened to pull him back into unconsciousness. After what seemed like hours, the landscape changed. They entered a dense section of old-growth forest, the massive trees providing some shelter from the relentless snow. The creature ducked beneath low-hanging branches, following what appeared to be a game trail. Though Mason noticed signs, it had been subtly widened and maintained. They approached what looked like a solid rock face, barely visible through the swirling snow. The creature paused, shifting Mason's weight to one arm while using its free hand to push aside a cleverly arranged screen of branches. Behind this camouflage lay the dark mouth of a cave. The transition from howling storm to sheltered silence was jarring. The cave entrance narrowed quickly, forcing the creature to duck even lower. Then it widened again into a space Mason couldn't fully see in the darkness. The air was noticeably warmer, with none of the damp chill typical of mountain caves. A faint glow emanated from deeper within. The creature made another vocalization, louder, more complex, with distinct patterns that suggested language rather than animal calls. From the shadows came an answering call, higher in pitch. Mason wasn't alone with his rescuer. Panic threatened to overwhelm him. Injured, unable to flee, at the mercy of creatures science declared non-existent. Mason's heart raced dangerously. The one carrying him seemed to sense his distress, making that same reassuring rumble from earlier, while gently lowering him to a surface that felt like layered hides or thick vegetation. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, Mason realized he was in a large cavern. The subtle illumination came from a small fire pit in the center, carefully vented through a natural chimney in the rock ceiling. Around the edges of the space, he could make out primitive furnishings, sleeping platforms, storage areas with what appeared to be food and tools. Movement in the shadows revealed a second figure, smaller than his rescuer, but similarly proportioned. It approached cautiously, carrying something in its hands. As it knelt beside him, Mason saw it was a crude container made from tightly woven plant fibers, filled with water. The smaller creature helped raise Mason's head, bringing the container to his cracked lips. The water was cool and clean, soothing his parched throat. His backpack was placed nearby, the contents already removed and arranged with surprising care. His medical kit lay open, bandages and medications sorted into distinct groups. With gentle but powerful hands, his rescuer began examining his injuries, communicating with the smaller creature through a series of sounds, gestures and expressions that clearly conveyed information. Mason, trained to observe and document, couldn't help but marvel at the sophistication of this exchange. "You understand injury," he whispered. "You're helping me." The larger creature paused in its examination, meeting Mason's eyes directly. It placed one massive hand gently over its own chest, then extended it toward Mason in a gesture as old as humanity itself. Mason had discovered more than a new species. He'd found people. Mason woke to the soft crackling of a small fire and the smell of something earthy and pungent. His body felt unusually warm, wrapped in what appeared to be layers of animal hides. His right arm had been splintered with strips of bark and plant fiber, bound with remarkable precision. The sharp pain in his ribs had dulled to a persistent ache. His chest wrapped tightly with a poultice of crushed vegetation, held in place by more plant fibers. He carefully propped himself up on his good arm, wincing as his body protested the movement. In the improved light of day, filtering through small fissures high in the cave ceiling, he could properly see his surroundings for the first time. The cave was larger than he'd initially thought, roughly 30 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling rising to about 12 feet at its center. The living area had been meticulously organized. Sleeping platforms lined the walls, elevated off the ground on frameworks of interwoven branches. Various containers, some woven from plant fibers, others hollowed from wood or made from animal bladders, were arranged by size and apparent purpose. Most striking were the tools. Stone implements with wooden handles, bound with sinew, bone needles, scrapers for preparing hides, all showing a level of craftsmanship that spoke of generational knowledge, passed down and refined. Movement drew Mason's attention to the cave entrance. The larger creature, the one who had carried him through the storm, ducked through the narrow opening, bringing with it a blast of cold air that made the fire flicker. Outside, the blizzard continued unabated. In daylight, Mason could see his rescuer more clearly. Male, he guessed, standing nearly 8 feet tall, but with proportions remarkably similar to a large human. The creature carried Mason's emergency medical kit, evidently retrieved from the scattered contents of his pack. The being approached cautiously, respectful of Mason's personal space, despite the obvious power differential. He placed the medical kit within Mason's reach, then sat cross-legged nearby, observing with unmistakable curiosity. "Thank you," Mason said simply, his voice raspy from cold and dehydration. The creature tilted his head, showing comprehension of the tone, if not the specific words. He reached for one of the containers and offered it to Mason, the same water vessel from the previous night. As Mason drank, he noticed the strange herbal poultice on his chest. Green-brown in color with flecks of red, it gave off the pungent odor he'd detected earlier. Whatever it contained was clearly medicinal. The deep ache in his ribs had subsided significantly since he'd first regained consciousness. "What is this?" Mason asked, gesturing to the poultice. The creature made a series of sounds, clearly an attempt to communicate, then seemed to reconsider. Rising with surprising grace for his size, he moved to a storage area and returned with samples of several plants. Some Mason recognized arnica, devil's club, willow bark, known for their anti-inflammatory properties. Others were unfamiliar, including a reddish root that, when the creature mimed crushing it, Mason realized was the source of the distinctive odor. "You're a healer," Mason said with newfound respect. A second creature entered, the smaller one from the previous night. Female, Mason guessed, carrying an armful of dry wood for the fire. She moved with the same deliberate grace as the male, suggesting not just physical capability, but a cultural practice of mindful movement. She spoke to the male in their language, a complex series of vocalizations, clicks, and subtle hand movements. Mason listened intently, his trained ear picking out repeated sounds and patterns, not random animal calls, but a true language with syntax and structure. The pair seemed to be discussing him, with occasional gestures in his direction. The female appeared more cautious, the male more protective. A debate about their unexpected guest, perhaps. Finally, they appeared to reach a consensus. The female approached, kneeling beside Mason with a small wooden bowl containing a steaming liquid. The fragrance suggested a tea made from some of the same medicinal plants in his poultice. She mimed drinking, then pointed to his wrapped ribs. Trust was a two-way street. Mason accepted the bowl and sipped carefully. The taste was bitter but not unpleasant, with undertones of something like cinnamon. Almost immediately, warmth spread through his chest, the pain receding further. "Remarkable," he murmured. While he drank, the male retrieved something else, Mason's camera. The lens was indeed cracked, but the device itself appeared intact. The creature held it carefully, clearly puzzled by its purpose, but treating it as something important to Mason. "It captures images," Mason explained, setting down the empty bowl and reaching for the camera with his good hand. Like memories, he turned it on, relieved to see it still functioned. He slowly navigated to the image display and showed the screen to his hosts. They leaned forward, expressions of astonishment clear on their faces as they saw digital representations of the forest, the mountains, and in the final images, a blurry shape that Mason now recognized as his rescuer. The male made a sound of recognition, pointing to himself and then to the image. The connection established, he gently took the camera back and set it with Mason's other possessions, now neatly arranged near his sleeping platform. Mason settled back, exhaustion reclaiming him despite his fascination. As his eyes grew heavy, he realized two things with absolute clarity. First, he had discovered not just an unknown species, but an unknown people with language, medicine, and culture. Second, he had been brought here not just to be saved, but to be studied, just as he had come to the mountains to study them. Days blended together as the blizzard raged outside. Mason's strength returned gradually, aided by the creature's remarkable medicines and regular servings of a nutrient-rich stew. His ribs still ached, but the crushing pain had subsided to a manageable discomfort. His frostbitten hand had healed with surprising speed, the damaged tissue regenerating under the application of a different poultice. With physical recovery came mental clarity and professional focus. Mason had spent his life documenting the undocumented, and now he faced the discovery of a lifetime. Using his uninjured hand, he began sketching in his weather-resistant notebook, creating a visual record of his hosts and their environment. The male, whom Mason had begun thinking of as the healer, watched these activities with evident fascination. On the third day, he brought Mason a flat piece of tree bark, its surface smoothed by deliberate work. Using a charcoal stick from the fire's edge, the healer drew a simple but recognizable image of the mountain, then pointed outside. "Yes, the mountain," Mason confirmed, tapping the drawing. He took the charcoal and added a small human figure on the slope. "Me, Mason," he pointed to himself. The healer considered this, then carefully made a sound, a two-syllable vocalization that Mason interpreted as their word for human. Mason repeated it, earning an approving nod. The healer then pointed to himself and made a different sound. "Your name," Mason realized. He attempted to reproduce the sound, failing initially, but improving with each try until the healer nodded in satisfaction. The female, who seemed to serve as the group's forager and food preparer, observed these exchanges with cautious interest. Eventually, she joined them, offering her own name sound. Mason noticed it shared a tonal quality with the healer's name, perhaps indicating a familial relationship. Their communication evolved rapidly from these beginnings. Mason's professional experience with indigenous languages proved invaluable as he began cataloging sounds and their apparent meanings. The creatures, in turn, demonstrated remarkable linguistic adaptability, quickly recognizing patterns in Mason's speech. By the fifth day, they had established a crude pictographic system using bark slabs. The healer drew an image of the cave, then added several tall figures around it. He pointed to each, making different name sounds. There are more of you, Mason realized. A community. Using their growing system of shared communication, Mason gathered that the storm had separated the healer and his companion, possibly his mate, from their larger group. They had been tracking Mason since he entered their territory, concerned about his presence, but also curious. When the avalanche struck, the healer had made the decision to intervene. Why? Mason asked, creating a question symbol they had established, a simple curved line. The answer came through a series of drawings and gestures that took Mason time to interpret. The creatures had observed humans before, but always from a distance. They recognized tools, clothing, behaviors. They understood that humans could be dangerous, but also that humans possessed knowledge and abilities different from their own. Mason, alone in their territory and respectful of the environment, had presented an opportunity for safe contact. The revelation stunned Mason. These beings hadn't just saved him on impulse, they had been making calculated observations and decisions about him, assessing his character and potential threat level. The scientific implications were staggering. Not just a new primate species, but one with advanced cognitive abilities, social structures, and ethical frameworks. As their communication deepened, Mason began sharing his own knowledge. He drew simple anatomical sketches showing how their respective species were similar yet different. The healer absorbed this information eagerly, making connections Mason wouldn't have expected. When Mason showed them his map, their interest intensified. The healer took the charcoal and marked several areas, places Mason interpreted as territorial boundaries and migration routes. They had a clear understanding of geography and seasonal patterns. One evening, as they sat around the fire sharing a meal of preserved meat and foraged roots, Mason retrieved his camera. The battery was running low, but he wanted to document their communication breakthrough. He showed the healer how to access the previous images, including landscapes from Mason's earlier expeditions. The healer studied these with intense concentration, then made an excited sound to his companion. He pointed to a specific mountain valley in one image, then to himself, then held up 5 fingers twice. "You've been there? 10 seasons ago?" Mason guessed, based on their established counting system. The healer confirmed with a nod, then carefully drew a new symbol on a bark slate, a rough circle with radiating lines. He pointed to the image again, then outside, making a sweeping gesture toward the sky. "The sun?" Mason asked, confused. The healer shook his head, adding to his drawing, a smaller circle orbiting the first. He pointed to the night sky visible through the cave's ventilation opening. "Moon cycles," Mason realized. "You're telling me when to go there." The creatures exchanged sounds that Mason had come to recognize as their version of agreement. Through additional drawings and gestures, Mason pieced together their message. When 10 moon cycles had passed, their entire group would travel through that valley during their seasonal migration. They were inviting him to a planned meeting. That night, as Mason added to his growing journal of observations, the weight of responsibility settled over him. These beings had chosen to trust him with knowledge that could either protect their kind or lead to their exploitation. Their existence challenged everything humanity thought it knew about cognitive evolution and species development. And they had just given him the most valuable scientific opportunity in history. The storm finally broke after 7 days, leaving the world transformed under feet of pristine snow. Mason stood at the cave entrance, breathing deeply of the crisp, clean air. His injuries had healed enough for careful movement, though the healer watched his every step with protective concern. A series of low, rhythmic calls echoed across the valley. The healer and his companion grew alert, exchanging quick vocalizations. The female disappeared deeper into the cave, returning with what looked like a simple necklace, made of polished stones, wooden beads, and small bones. She approached Mason, indicating he should bow his head. "A gift?" Mason asked, using their shared gesture for offerings. The healer shook his head, pointing to the necklace and then making a protective motion around Mason. "Not a gift, a marker. Something that identified him as under their protection." Mason allowed the female to place it around his neck. The craftsmanship was impressive up close. Each bead carved with simple but distinct patterns, the stones polished to a soft luster. The central element appeared to be a bear claw, modified and wrapped with colored plant fibers. More calls sounded, closer now. The healer responded with a complex series of vocalizations, clearly communicating their situation to the approaching group. Mason felt a flutter of nervous excitement. More of these beings were about to arrive, a scientific revelation, walking on two legs. They emerged from the tree line in single file, moving with the same deliberate grace Mason had observed in his hosts. 5 individuals of varying heights, their powerful bodies adapted perfectly to the mountain environment. The group paused at the sight of Mason, maintaining distance while the healer approached them. An intricate exchange followed. Vocalizations, hand gestures, body postures, clearly explaining Mason's presence. The newcomers studied him with intense curiosity but no apparent fear. One taller than even the healer stepped forward. The silver gray streaking in his facial hair and the deference shown by the others marked him as a leader of some kind. The healer beckoned Mason forward, gesturing to the necklace as if reminding the others of Mason's protected status. The leader examined Mason with intelligent eyes, set deep under a pronounced brow ridge. After a long moment, he reached out one massive hand, palm up, the universal gesture of peaceful greeting. Mason placed his much smaller hand on the leader's palm, feeling rough calluses and remarkable warmth. "Thank you for accepting me," he said, knowing the words wouldn't be understood, but the tone would. The leader made a sound of acknowledgement, then turned to lead the group toward the cave. As they filed past, Mason observed their distinct characteristics. 2 were clearly younger, possibly adolescents based on their proportions and behavior. Another was elderly, moving more stiffly, but treated with obvious respect. The 5th carried a young infant secured to her chest with a carrier made of woven fibers and hides. A family group, Mason realized. Not just isolated individuals, but a social unit with clear roles and relationships. The scientific implications were staggering. Inside the cave, the reunion unfolded with obvious joy. The healer and his companion were welcomed, back with embraces and what sounded like storytelling, animated recounting, of their separation during the storm and subsequent time with Mason. The infant was passed to the healer, who examined it with professional attention before making approving sounds. A healer for the entire group then, not just Mason's caretaker. The elderly one approached Mason with cautious curiosity, studying his clothing and features. Using a walking staff carved from a single piece of wood, he pointed to Mason's eyes, then his own, making a questioning sound. "Yes, different colors," Mason said, understanding the query. "Mine are blue, yours are brown." The elder made the sound again, this time pointing to Mason's beard, then his own facial hair. Mason realized he was being catalogued, similarities and differences noted with scientific precision. Not unlike Mason's own observational methods, the leader orchestrated a redistribution of supplies the group had carried, food, medicinal plants, and what appeared to be newly crafted tools. Mason observed the clear social structure: leadership, caregiving, knowledge-keeping, and provision. These weren't just intelligent animals. They were a society. As evening approached, the group settled around the fire. Food was prepared and distributed according to what seemed to be established custom. Mason was given a portion placed on a flat stone plate, along with a new drinking vessel made from carved wood. The ritual nature of the meal became clear as the leader offered what sounded like words before they began eating. A prayer, a blessing, whatever its purpose, the ceremony reinforced Mason's growing understanding that these beings possessed spirituality alongside their practical intelligence. After the meal, attention turned to Mason. The leader spoke to him directly, making gestures Mason interpreted as questions about his presence in their territory. Using their rudimentary shared communication system, Mason explained his work as a wildlife photographer and researcher. This prompted great interest. The younger ones crowded closer as Mason showed them his camera again, this time with fresh batteries from his recovered pack. He took photos of the group, showing them the digital images to gasps of wonder. When he reached for his notebook to continue their pictographic communication, the leader surprised him by producing something unexpected, a flat piece of what appeared to be preserved animal skin, marked with intricate patterns. A map, Mason realized with astonishment, showing the surrounding mountain ranges with remarkable accuracy. The leader pointed to different locations, making sounds Mason interpreted as place names. When he indicated a specific valley, the entire group made a unified sound of recognition. Home. They were showing him their permanent settlement. With his strength returning, Mason began accompanying the group on short excursions outside the cave. The leader, whom Mason now mentally called the elder chief, always assigned one of the younger males to stay close, ostensibly to assist if Mason's injuries troubled him, but clearly also to ensure he didn't wander off alone, using bark, charcoal, and occasionally his own notebook. Mason had created a primitive journal, documenting their language and customs. He now recognized nearly 50 distinct vocalizations and their apparent meanings, plus numerous compound sounds that formed more complex concepts. Their language contained sophisticated elements, past and future tenses, abstract concepts, even humor. Food gather now, his companion indicated through their developing communication system as they set out one clear morning. The snow had compacted enough for careful travel, though Mason still found himself struggling to match their effortless movement through the terrain. They approached a grove of pine trees, where the young male demonstrated an ingenious technique for harvesting the nutritious inner bark without harming the trees. He used a bone tool to make a small, precise incision, then carefully peeled away just enough bark to access the cambium layer beneath. After harvesting a small amount, he packed the wound with a resinous mixture that seemed to protect the tree from insects and disease. Sustainable harvesting, Mason murmured appreciatively, noting how different trees showed healed marks from previous years, evidence of generational knowledge about resource management. The creature gave him an approving nod, recognizing Mason's understanding. He then led the way to a rocky outcropping, where, after carefully scanning for predators, he began digging beneath the snow to uncover a hidden cache of nuts and dried berries. "You prepared for winter," Mason said, using their gesture for advanced planning. "You anticipated where food would be scarce." Through careful observation over the subsequent days, Mason documented similar evidence of sophisticated environmental knowledge. The group possessed detailed understanding of animal migration patterns, plant cycles, and weather indicators that surpassed many human trackers Mason had met. Most fascinating was their deliberate invisibility. During one excursion, they encountered signs of human presence, old boot prints preserved under a protected overhang. The entire group immediately shifted behavior, moving with even greater stealth and carefully obscuring their tracks using branches and natural debris. When Mason questioned this through their communication system, the elder chief's response was clear and sobering. Using diagrams scratched into bark and pantomimed actions, he conveyed stories of ancestors hunted by humans, forced from territories, even killed. Their survival strategy was complete separation, Observation without interaction, avoidance without confrontation. You've been hiding in plain sight, Mason realized. For generations. Each evening, Mason added to his knowledge journal, documenting not just biological characteristics, but social structures and cultural practices. He observed how the group made decisions collectively, with the elder chief facilitating rather than dictating. How knowledge was passed through demonstration and guided practice. How conflicts were resolved through ritualized displays rather than physical aggression. The infant became a particular focus of Mason's observations. Each adult took turns caring for the child, regardless of apparent biological relationship. They engaged in what Mason recognized as deliberately educational play, teaching tool use, food recognition, and communication through structured interactions that grew progressively more complex as the child responded correctly. One night, as the group settled around the fire, the elderly member, whom Mason had come to think of as the historian, began what was clearly a storytelling session. Using vocalizations, gestures, and facial expressions of remarkable nuance, he conveyed what Mason understood to be an origin story. The tale, as Mason interpreted it, described the group's ancestors living alongside early humans, initially in cooperation, but eventually driven to separation by human aggression and territorial expansion. The historian pantomimed the gradual retreat to higher elevations, the development of concealment techniques, and the decision to observe humanity from a distance while preserving their own distinct culture. Most striking was a sequence describing human technological development: fire, metal tools, weapons that killed from a distance, machines that cut through forests. The historian's depiction revealed not just observation, but sophisticated understanding of human innovation and its environmental impact. Through daily immersion, Mason's comprehension of their communication system grew exponentially. By the second week, he could engage in simple exchanges about concrete topics. By the third, he began grasping abstract concepts. Their mathematical understanding particularly impressed him. They used a base 8 counting system tied to their physical anatomy, with sophisticated conceptual applications for tracking time, distances, and quantities. Mason's professional excitement occasionally gave way to profound ethical questions. The group had saved his life and shared their knowledge, trusting him despite generations of learned wariness toward humans. Their existence would revolutionize anthropology, primatology, and evolutionary biology, if revealed. But such revelation would forever end their peaceful isolation. The healer seemed to sense Mason's internal conflict. One evening, he brought a specially prepared medicinal tea and led Mason to a quiet corner of the cave. There, using their most advanced communication methods, he asked a question that transcended the barriers between their species. Knowledge, share, others, question, danger. Mason stared into the depths of his tea, the weight of scientific discovery balanced against the responsibility of protection. "Yes," he replied simply. "In knowledge, others, danger possible." The healer nodded, understanding the impossible choice his human guest now faced. The distant sound of voices shattered the peaceful morning. Human voices calling Mason's name. The entire Bigfoot group froze, instantly alert. The youngsters were quickly ushered deeper into the cave, while the elder chief and the healer moved to the entrance, listening intently. Mason joined them, his heart racing with conflicting emotions. "Search and rescue," he explained, using their shared gestures for human seeking. "They're looking for me." The elder chief's expression conveyed clear alarm. He made a sweeping motion toward the mountain passes, the direction the voices were coming from, then pointed to the group's few possessions, making the sign for rapid movement. "You're preparing to leave," Mason realized. To avoid detection, the healer disappeared deeper into the cave, returning moments later with something clutched in his massive hand. He offered it to Mason, a weather-beaten flyer with Mason's photograph and the words "Missing Hiker" printed above it. The paper was creased and water-stained, but still legible, with contact information for the ranger station and search coordinator. Mason stared at it in astonishment. "Where did you find this?" Through gestures and their rudimentary shared language, the healer explained that the humans had been posting these throughout the search area. The group had been monitoring the search party's movements, staying well ahead of them while collecting information about their patterns and intentions. The voices grew louder, multiple teams, using a grid search pattern by the sound of it. Professional rescuers, not volunteers. They would be thorough, methodical, and equipped with advanced tools. "We need to leave now," the elder chief communicated urgently, already organizing the group's evacuation. Mason watched their efficient preparations with growing distress. These beings who had saved him, cared for him, shared their knowledge. With him, they were now being forced to abandon their shelter and possibly face dangerous travel conditions because humans were coming to his rescue. The irony was painful. The youngest adult male approached, carrying Mason's backpack, now repaired and repacked with his belongings. The message was clear. Mason was expected to rejoin his kind. "Wait," Mason said, using both vocal and gesture communication. "I need to think." The elder chief paused, studying Mason with those intelligent eyes that had seen generations of human encroachment. He made a simple gesture, pointing to Mason, then to the direction of the voices, then to his own group, and finally making their sign for choice. Mason had to decide where his loyalty lay. The search party's voices continued to approach. They would reach the cave within an hour at their current pace. Mason could wait for them, return to civilization, share his incredible discovery with the scientific community. His photographs, recordings, and notes would revolutionize our understanding of primate evolution and cognitive development. Or he could help these remarkable beings escape detection, preserving their privacy and safety at the cost of immediate rescue and scientific recognition. "How many days to your home territory?" Mason asked through their communication system. The elder chief indicated 3 days' travel through passes only they knew. "Difficult terrain, but manageable if they moved quickly. And if I stay? If I go with the humans?" The group exchanged looks. The healer made a gesture Mason had learned meant permanent separation. They would never allow themselves to be found again, would abandon this entire region rather than risk human contact. Mason closed his eyes, weighing his options. Emily would be frantic by now. The scientific community would benefit immeasurably from his documentation. He had injuries that would heal better with proper medical care, but these beings had trusted him, had saved him when they could have simply watched him die, had shared their knowledge and culture despite generations of justified fear. The search party's voices grew louder. A dog barked. They were using tracking animals. The elder chief made a decisive sound, gesturing for final preparations. They could wait no longer. Mason looked down at the search flyer in his hands, his own face staring back at him. His finger traced the contact information. Chuck Dawson's name and number prominently displayed as search coordinator. "I need to make a signal," Mason said suddenly. "To tell them I'm alive but don't need rescue." The healer tilted his head. Not fully comprehending, Mason rummaged through his pack, finding his emergency signal mirror, standard equipment for wilderness survival. "If I reflect sunlight in a pattern, they'll see it. They'll know it's deliberate, human-made." The group watched with cautious interest as Mason explained his plan. He would signal the search party, let them know he was alive, but would not reveal his location or the existence of his hosts. The signal would buy time. The search would continue, but with less urgency, allowing the group to retreat safely to their territory. "I'm choosing to protect you," Mason told the elder chief, using their gesture for trust bond. The elder chief studied Mason for a long moment, then made a new gesture, touching his own chest, then Mason's, then sweeping his hand to encompass the entire group. Inclusion, acceptance. Mason wasn't just a guest anymore. He was being offered something far more profound: family. The sound of the search dog's bark echoed closer. Time had run out for deliberation. Mason clutched the signal mirror in one hand and his backpack in the other, facing the most important decision of his life. Mason stood at the mouth of the cave, signal mirror clutched tightly in his hand. Sunlight glinted off its polished surface as he turned it over and over, weighing more than just the physical object. The search party's voices carried clearly now, perhaps half a mile away and closing. Professional rescuers, calling his name with the practiced cadence of those who had done this many times before. They would have medical supplies, communications equipment, transportation back to civilization, back to his life. Behind him, the Bigfoot group waited in tense silence. They had packed only essentials, medicinal plants, food stores, and primitive tools. Their home of many weeks would be abandoned, perhaps forever, because humans sought one of their own. "If I go with them," Mason said quietly, addressing the elder chief. "What happens to this knowledge?" He gestured to his notebook filled with observations, his camera with its irreplaceable images. The elder chief's response came through their now fluid communication system, a blend of gestures, expressions and vocalizations that Mason had grown adept at interpreting. The message was clear. Human knowledge of their existence had historically brought only suffering. Hunters with guns, territory lost, family members killed or captured. Mason closed his eyes, remembering his life's work. 30 years documenting endangered species, advocating for habitat preservation, fighting against the human tendency to destroy what it didn't understand. He had dedicated his career to being the voice for the voiceless. Now he faced the ultimate test of those principles. The images flickered through his mind. Laboratory examinations, media circuses, government interventions, private collectors offering bounties. Even with the best intentions, exposure would forever change these beings' existence. Their autonomy would end the moment humanity confirmed their reality. "I need to think," Mason whispered. Stepping outside onto the narrow ledge that fronted the cave, the mountains stretched before him, valleys filled with morning mist, peaks gleaming with snow in the clear air after the storm. Below, he could see tiny figures moving through the forest, the search teams methodically covering ground. Growing closer by the minute, Mason had discovered numerous species throughout his career, rare orchids, previously undocumented insects, a frog thought extinct for 50 years. Each discovery had brought professional accolades, research funding, publications. He had built a respected career on finding and documenting the overlooked wonders of the natural world. But this was different. These weren't simply animals to be classified, tagged, and studied. They were people with culture, language, social structures, and a right to determine their own destiny. People who had developed sophisticated strategies to avoid human detection, precisely because they understood the consequences of discovery. The signal mirror felt suddenly heavy in his hand. With it, he could alert the search party that he was alive without revealing his location or his companions. Or he could simply let it drop into the ravine below, making his decision irrevocable. "Dad." The voice floated up from the search party, closer now, distinct enough for Mason to recognize its owner. Emily. His daughter was among the searchers. His heart clenched. Emily, who had warned him against this expedition, who had already lost her mother and now feared losing her father too. Emily, who deserved to know he was alive, to be spared the grief of his disappearance. Mason felt the healer's presence beside him. The massive being gestured toward the sound of Emily's voice, then made their sign for blood bond. "Yes, my daughter," Mason confirmed. "My family." The healer considered this, then made a series of gestures that took Mason a moment to interpret. Temporary separation, future meeting, secret keeping. "You're suggesting a compromise," Mason realized. "I return to my family now, but meet you again later. And keep your secret," the healer nodded, then pointed to Mason's pack, making their sign for knowledge capture. Mason's notes, photographs, recordings, he could keep them, study them privately, but not share them publicly. Personal knowledge, not global exposure. The elder chief approached, having overheard the exchange. His expression was grave as he considered the healer's suggestion. After a long moment, he added his own gesture: trust, bond, choice, consequence. The message was clear. Mason would be trusted with their secret, but that trust carried enormous responsibility. The choice he made now would have permanent consequences for their people. Mason looked down at the signal mirror again, then at the search party moving through the trees below. Emily's voice called his name again, the professional calm starting to crack with emotional strain. His decision crystallized with sudden clarity. Mason raised the mirror, catching the sunlight and reflecting it in a deliberate pattern. 3 short flashes. 3 long, 3 short. SOS, the universal distress signal, visible for miles in the clear mountain air. "I'm going back to them," he told his hosts through their shared communication. "But I will protect your secret. No one will know you exist." The elder chief studied Mason's face, searching for deception or uncertainty. Finding none, he made a single gesture, their sign for time passing, but with a specific modification Mason recognized. A specific number. 10 moon cycles. The meeting they had discussed. Mason nodded, committing the time and location to memory. As shouts of excitement rose from below, the search party had spotted his signal. Mason looked one last time at the beings who had saved him, taught him, and changed his understanding of what it meant to be a person. "I will see you again," he promised. "And your secret dies with me." The signal mirror's flash had been seen, but in the rugged terrain, the search party would need hours to reach its source. This brief window gave Mason and his hosts time for hasty preparations and farewells. "I'll tell them I survived in a natural cave," Mason explained through their shared communication system. "That I was injured, but managed to find shelter and food. Nothing about you." The elder chief nodded gravely, then made a decisive gesture. Mason would not be returning to the humans immediately. The search party's approach had accelerated their plans, but the group still intended to travel to their winter settlement. Mason would accompany them for part of this journey, staying long enough to ensure the search parties had moved on from their territory before circling back to be rescued. 2 days, Mason suggested. Enough time for them to focus their search elsewhere. As the group departed, Mason cast one final glance at the cave that had been his sanctuary. His decision set, he shouldered his pack, now considerably lighter without his emergency supplies, which he'd left arranged near the cave entrance as evidence of his survival, and followed the Bigfoots into the wilderness. They moved with astonishing speed and efficiency through the deep snow, using natural features to conceal their tracks. The youngsters carried the infant in shifts, protected against the cold by an ingeniously crafted carrier made of hides and plant fibers. Mason struggled to keep pace, his human physiology not evolved for this environment despite decades of wilderness experience. Observing his difficulty, the healer fashioned impromptu snowshoes for Mason using flexible branches and strips of bark, significantly improving his mobility. By nightfall, they had covered nearly 15 miles of rugged terrain, putting considerable distance between themselves and the search parties. Their temporary camp that night was a marvel of efficient adaptation. No fire that might draw attention, but a shelter built within an hour that trapped body heat remarkably well. The group huddled together for warmth, with Mason included in their circle without hesitation. His thin human skin and relative lack of insulating body hair made him the most vulnerable to the cold, a fact they recognized and accommodated by placing him in the warmest position. As darkness fell, Mason observed how they shared food, preserved meat and nuts from their emergency stores. The distribution followed clear patterns: the elderly, the young, and the nursing mother first, then the others according to apparent need rather than status. The elder chief ate last, taking only what remained after everyone else was satisfied. By the second day, Mason had begun adapting to their travel rhythm. His clothes, though technologically advanced, proved less effective against the mountain winter than the Bigfoot's natural insulation. Noticing his discomfort despite his efforts to hide it, two of the younger adults fashioned additional layers for him from spare hides in their packs, showing him how to wear them for maximum heat retention. "These are remarkable," Mason said, examining the ingenious construction. The hides had been scraped, cured, and softened using only primitive tools, yet the craftsmanship rivaled commercial products. The female, who had helped create the garment, demonstrated how certain areas were intentionally thicker to protect vital organs, while joints remained flexible for movement. Mason recognized design principles that outdoor clothing manufacturers had only discovered in recent decades. That evening, as they established another temporary camp, Mason witnessed their sophisticated knowledge exchange. The historian, using only natural materials at hand, created a detailed map on a flat stone, outlining their planned route with remarkable accuracy. Each member contributed observations about conditions, potential food sources, or hazards they had noticed during the day's travel. The collective intelligence of the group proved far more comprehensive than any individual's knowledge could be. Mason's professional fascination never waned. Every interaction, every tool used, every decision made revealed new insights into their society. He documented as much as he could in his journal, creating a record of knowledge that would never see publication, but would forever change his understanding of intelligence and adaptation. On the morning of the third day, they reached a natural fork in their route. One path led deeper into the mountains toward their winter settlement. The other curved back toward areas frequented by humans. The elder chief indicated that this was their parting point. The farewells were surprisingly emotional. The youngsters approached Mason with small gifts, a carefully crafted bone tool, a pouch of medicinal herbs whose properties he had admired. The healer presented him with a specially prepared mixture for his still healing ribs, packed in a small container made from birch bark. Most meaningful was the elder chief's gift, a small section of his own winter garment, modified to fit inside Mason's jacket. The message was clear. A piece of their protection would remain with him. Through their communication system, the elder chief confirmed their planned meeting after 10 moon cycles. He then made a series of gestures indicating specific landscapes and landmarks, alternative meeting locations if the primary site proved compromised. "I'll be there," Mason promised, committing each backup location to memory. As he prepared to depart, the entire group performed what Mason recognized as a blessing ritual, each member placing a hand on him briefly while making a specific vocalization. A formal acknowledgement of his acceptance into their community despite his imminent return to the human world. Mason watched them disappear into the forest, moving like shadows between the trees. Within moments, despite their size, they had vanished completely, a skill perfected over generations of avoiding human detection. Alone now, Mason adjusted his borrowed cold-weather garments and turned toward the path that would lead him back to his own kind. 2 worlds now lived within him, the civilization he was returning to and the profound alternative he had glimpsed. Whatever came next, he was irrevocably changed. Mason navigated the familiar terrain with renewed confidence, following game trails that would eventually lead to areas frequented by hikers. His plan was simple, appeared disoriented but alive, with a plausible story of survival that required no mention of his extraordinary companions. As he rounded a steep ridge, an unfamiliar sound stopped him mid-stride, mechanical, rhythmic, a chainsaw. Logging was prohibited in this wilderness area. The sound was as out of place as a car horn. Mason changed direction, moving cautiously toward the disturbance. After 20 minutes of careful approach, he spotted them. 3 men in heavy winter gear, operating equipment near the base of a massive old-growth pine. Their truck, parked on what barely qualified as a logging road, bore no official forestry markings. Poachers, illegal loggers, targeting the ancient trees that fetched premium prices on the black market. Under normal circumstances, Mason would have documented their activities and reported them to authorities. But these weren't normal circumstances. The men's presence was less than 2 miles from the path his hosts would take to their winter settlement. As Mason watched from concealment, a fourth man emerged from the truck cab. The rifle slung casually over his shoulder suggested they weren't just after timber. The winter hunting season was closed. Any hunting here now was as illegal as their logging. Mason's stomach knotted as he considered the implications. His Bigfoot family, he'd come to think of them that way, would be traveling through this area within days. Their safety protocols were designed for avoiding typical hikers and rangers who stuck to established trails, not for armed poachers ranging deep into prohibited territories. A crash echoed through the forest as the massive pine began its fall. Mason winced at the destruction, but remained hidden, mind racing. He couldn't directly confront 4 armed men. Reporting them would mean revealing his own presence, triggering his rescue before he was ready, and potentially bringing more human activity into the area just as the Bigfoots were passing through. The men worked efficiently, sectioning the fallen giant with practiced speed. They'd clearly done this before. As they loaded the first cuts onto their truck, Mason noticed something that made his blood run cold. A large animal trap being prepared by the man with the rifle. Not the humane catch-and-release type used by wildlife researchers, but a vicious steel contraption designed to hold prey until the hunter returned. "Bear track over by the creek," the man called to his companions. "Big one. Worth trying for while we're out here." Mason had seen no bear tracks during his time with the Bigfoots, but he had seen their footprints. Large, distinctive, easily mistaken for a bear's by someone not looking closely. If the Bigfoots followed their planned route, they would pass directly through this area where traps were being set. He needed to warn them, but how? They were hours ahead by now, traveling quickly through terrain Mason couldn't hope to navigate alone at their speed. The loggers' truck engines started with a rumble. They were leaving, probably to return at dawn. Mason waited until the sound faded completely before emerging from his hiding place. Approaching cautiously, he examined the area where they had been working. The trap had indeed been set, partially concealed with brush, along what appeared to be a game trail leading toward water. Mason had spent enough time with professional trappers to know how to disarm it safely. Within minutes he had rendered it harmless and repositioned it so obviously that no animal would trigger it. But this was just one trap. There could be others, and the poachers would return. Mason needed to do more. Using deadfall from the log tree, he constructed a barrier across the small logging road. Not enough to stop determined men, but sufficient to force them to work to clear it, buying precious time. Then he gathered specific plants he'd learned from the healer, crushing them to release their pungent oils and spreading the mixture around the area. The scent would be nearly imperceptible to humans, but would serve as a warning to his hosts with their more sensitive olfaction. Next, Mason found a flat piece of bark and, using charcoal from the logger's abandoned fire pit, drew the symbols his Bigfoot family would recognize: danger human weapon, with directional indicators showing a safe alternate route. He placed these markers at strategic points along their likely path, high enough that human hikers would likely miss them, but his tall companions would easily spot them. As dusk approached, Mason made a difficult decision. He couldn't leave this area until he was certain his warning had been received. The search parties would continue looking, perhaps for days. Giving him the time he needed, he established a small, well-concealed observation post with a clear view of both the logging site and the approach from the direction his hosts would come. The waiting would be cold and uncomfortable, but the alternative was unthinkable. One of his Bigfoot family maimed or killed by an illegal trap. Or worse, confronted by armed poachers. Mason settled into his vigil as darkness fell, drawing the borrowed hide garments tightly around him. The forest grew quiet, except for the occasional call of a nightbird and the whisper of wind through the pines. His thoughts drifted to Emily, to the search parties undoubtedly still combing the mountains for him. The guilt of their worry weighed on him, but some responsibilities transcended even family bonds. He had promised to protect a secret that could change the world. That promise began here now with this simple act of guardianship. Dawn broke with the quiet beauty that had first drawn Mason to these mountains decades ago. His night watch had been long and cold, interrupted only by the distant howls of wolves and the occasional snap of branches under snow's weight. No sign of the poachers returning yet, but they would come. Men willing to risk fines and imprisonment for ancient timber wouldn't abandon their prize easily. Movement caught Mason's eye, deliberate and controlled, emerging from the forest's edge. Not human. The massive form of the elder chief materialized from the trees, followed by the healer. They had doubled back, perhaps sensing danger or having spotted Mason's warning signs. Relief flooded through him as they approached his position with remarkable stealth for creatures of their size. Through gesture and their now sophisticated shared communication, Mason quickly explained what he had discovered: the poachers, the traps, the danger to their planned route. The elder chief's expression darkened as he examined the dismantled trap Mason had collected. His hands moved in the deliberate patterns Mason had come to recognize as their language's equivalent of strategic planning. The route must be changed. The group, traveling with youngsters and the elderly, needed warning. The threat must be assessed. The healer produced something unexpected, a crude but functional map drawn on a piece of hide, showing their planned route and the location of their winter settlement. With remarkable precision, he indicated where the rest of their group would be by now, then marked alternative paths that would bypass the dangerous area entirely. "I need to reach them quickly," the healer communicated. "You and Elder Chief will monitor the human threat." Mason nodded, understanding the logic. The healer was their fastest individual, capable of covering ground with speed that still astonished Mason. The elder chief, with decades of experience avoiding human detection, was best suited to assess the ongoing danger. Before departing, the healer clasped Mason's shoulder, a gesture of trust and kinship that transcended their biological differences. Then he was gone, moving through the forest with fluid grace that left barely a trace in the snow. The elder chief led Mason to a better observation position overlooking the illegal logging site. Throughout the day, they watched as the poachers returned, clearing Mason's barricade with annoyed efficiency before resuming their destruction of the ancient forest. The trapper checked his line, discovering the disabled trap with visible anger, replacing it with another, while adding 2 more in different locations. Mason carefully noted each trap's position. After the men departed at dusk, he and the elder chief methodically disabled them all, this time removing key components and dispersing them widely to prevent easy repairs. The elder chief demonstrated techniques for obscuring the men's crude road further: strategic deadfall positioned to appear natural, subtle rearrangement of the landscape to make their route increasingly difficult. By the 3rd day, the healer had returned with news. The group had successfully diverted to the alternate route, adding 4 days to their journey but ensuring safety. More importantly, he had brought another map, this one more detailed than anything Mason had seen them produce before. The elder chief and healer conferred in their language, too rapid and nuanced for Mason to follow completely. Then they turned to him with what was clearly an important message. "It is time for me to return to my people," Mason guessed, reading their expressions and gestures. The elder chief confirmed with a solemn nod. The immediate danger had been addressed. The search for Mason would be growing more desperate. Further delay would only increase the risk of accidental discovery of their kind. Using the map and careful gestures, the elder chief showed Mason the safest route back to areas where he might encounter search teams. The path was marked with such precision that Mason recognized not just geography, but specific landmarks. A distinctive boulder formation, a creek with unique bends, a stand of aspens in otherwise coniferous forest. "You know the human world well," Mason observed, impressed by their detailed knowledge of territories they supposedly avoided. The elder chief's response was subtle but clear. Knowledge of potential threats was essential to survival. They had been watching humans for generations. mapping their movements, understanding their patterns, all while remaining undetected. The conversation shifted to their planned meeting after 10 moon cycles. The elder chief indicated a specific location on the map, not their winter settlement or any permanent dwelling, but a neutral site where observation would be possible from multiple approaches. Safety precautions were emphasized through careful gestures. Come alone, leave no trace, bring no tracking devices. Mason committed every detail to memory, then carefully handed the map back. Such evidence could never accompany him to the human world. As dusk approached on the third day, they shared a final meal, preserved meat and dried berries from the healer's pack. The ritual nature of the occasion was evident in how they arranged themselves, in the specific order of sharing, in the sounds they made that Mason recognized as blessings or prayers. When it was time to part, the elder chief produced one final gift, a small stone pendant, similar to the protective necklace Mason had worn in their community, but smaller, less noticeable. The symbol carved into its surface matched one on the elder chief's own ceremonial staff. Belonging, connection, protection. I will guard your secret, Mason promised, securing the pendant inside his shirt where it rested against his skin. And I will return. The elder chief placed one massive hand gently on Mason's head, a gesture between parent and child, between elder and younger, between leader and tribe member. The acceptance it represented transcended species, transcended the boundaries humans had drawn between themselves and the natural world. Then they were gone, melting into the forest with that uncanny ability that had kept them safe for centuries. Mason stood alone, the pendant warm against his chest, ready at last to return to his own kind. He turned toward the valley where search teams would likely be operating and began the final leg of his journey home. Mason heard the search dogs. First, their excited barking carrying through the crisp mountain air. He had been walking for nearly 6 hours, following the route the elder chief had shown him, deliberately leaving clear tracks in the snow. Now, sitting on a fallen log in a small clearing, he waited for his rescuers to find him. He had rehearsed his story carefully. Caught in the avalanche, partially buried but able to free himself. Injured and disoriented, finding shelter in a natural cave formation. Surviving on emergency rations and foraged food. Gradual recovery. Attempt to self-rescue once the storm cleared. All technically true, with strategic omissions. The dogs crested the ridge first, bounding through the snow with single-minded purpose. Behind them came 3 search and rescue professionals in their distinctive orange gear. The moment they spotted Mason, their professional demeanor momentarily broke into expressions of astonished relief. "We've got him," one called into her radio. "Repeat, we have located Reynolds. He's alive and sitting upright." They converged on him with practiced efficiency, immediately assessing his physical condition. Mason submitted to their examination, answering questions with the careful mixture of truth and omission he had prepared. Possible concussion history, the medic noted, examining the healing wound on Mason's temple. Ribs showing signs of previous trauma but healing well. Remarkable condition considering reported circumstances. The radio crackled with responses and redirection of other search teams. Among the voices, Mason heard Chuck Dawson from the ranger station, and beneath the professional coordination, the unmistakable sound of Emily's relieved weeping. "Can you walk?" the team leader asked. "Helicopter extraction is available, but the nearest suitable landing zone is 2 miles northeast." Mason nodded, rising steadily. "I can walk. Been doing it for days." The journey to the extraction point was surreal. After weeks in the exclusive company of beings who moved in harmonious silence with their environment, the constant radio chatter and heavy footfalls of his rescuers seemed jarringly discordant. Their questions continued, some professional, assessing his condition. Others curious, marveling at his survival. Mason provided his rehearsed narrative consistently, emphasizing his disorientation after the avalanche and the lucky discovery of the cave that had sheltered him. When asked about his improved-looking injuries, He credited basic first aid and medicinal plants he'd learned about over decades of wilderness experience. Not lies, just carefully curated truth. The helicopter appeared over the ridge right on schedule, the downwash from its rotors creating a miniature blizzard as it settled onto the small mountain meadow. Mason paused before boarding, turning to take in the vast wilderness one last time. Somewhere out there, his other family was traveling safely to their winter home, carrying knowledge of a connection that defied conventional understanding. "Dad?" Emily was waiting when they landed at the ranger station, her face showing the strain of weeks of uncertainty. She threw her arms around him with enough force to make his healing ribs protest, but Mason returned the embrace with equal intensity. "I told you I'd be careful," he said, with a weak attempt at humor. Emily's tear-streaked face shifted from relief to exasperation. 3 weeks, Dad. You were missing for 3 weeks in sub-zero conditions." The next hours passed in a blur of medical examinations, debriefings with search coordinators, and preparation of official reports. Mason maintained his story with calm consistency, deflecting more probing questions with the fatigue that required no acting to convey. The examining physician at the small regional hospital seemed particularly interested in the remnants of the herbal poultices still visible on some of Mason's healing wounds. "Never seen anything quite like this," he commented, scraping a small sample into a container. "Some kind of traditional remedy?" "Old wilderness guide taught me," Mason replied with practiced casualness. "Works better than anything from a pharmacy." The doctor raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. "Well, whatever it is, it prevented infection remarkably well. Your injuries are healing at an unusual rate for a man your age." When finally left alone in the hospital room, an IV replenishing his fluids despite his protests that he was adequately hydrated, Mason carefully checked that the Bigfoot pendant remained safely hidden beneath his hospital gown. Its presence against his skin provided strange comfort in this world of fluorescent lights, electronic beeping, and antiseptic smells. Emily returned with coffee and a change of clothes, settling into the chair beside his bed. "The story's already hit the national news," she said. "They're calling you the Mountain Miracle Man. 3 publications have reached out for exclusive rights to your story." Mason winced. "Not interested? Dad, this could fund your retirement. They're offering serious money." "I said no, Em." His tone was firmer than intended. "No interviews, no exclusives. I just want to recover quietly." Emily studied him with the perceptive gaze she'd inherited from her mother. "What happened out there, really?" Mason met her eyes, seeing the same intelligence that had made Clara his perfect partner for 30 years. Emily wouldn't be easily deceived, especially not by her father. "I survived," he said simply. "It changed my perspective on some things." "Like what?" Mason gazed out the window at the mountains visible in the distance. "Like what matters? Like what should remain wild." The hospital ID bracelet felt strange around his wrist, a manufactured tether to civilization after weeks of primal existence. According to his admission papers, he was suffering from exposure and possible delusions consistent with isolation. Trauma. The attending psychiatrist had suggested a thorough psychological evaluation. Once his physical condition stabilized, they thought they were welcoming him back to reality, never suspecting that their reality was now the illusion, a thin veneer of certainty over a world far more complex and wondrous than human science had yet acknowledged. Mason closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his secret. 10 moon cycles until he would see his other family again. Until then, he would have to navigate this world of noise and concrete and skepticism, carrying private knowledge that would be dismissed as the ravings of a traumatized mind if he ever chose to share it. "Get some rest, Dad," Emily said, squeezing his hand. "I'll be right here." For the first time in weeks, Mason slept in a proper bed, dreaming of massive figures moving silently through snowy forests, their knowledge and dignity intact. Their existence still their own. Spring arrived with a gentle persistence that matched Mason's recovery. The media frenzy around his miraculous survival had eventually subsided when he steadfastly refused all interview requests. His hospital stay had been mercifully brief. the doctors unable to find any reason to keep a man whose injuries were healing remarkably. Well, despite his age and ordeal, Emily had insisted he stay with her family for the first month, watching him with barely concealed concern as he adjusted to life indoors. Mason had accepted her care graciously while quietly planning his next steps. The weight of the stone pendant against his chest served as a constant reminder of his promise. By late April, he had made his decision. The real estate agent was surprised when Mason specified exactly what he wanted: a remote cabin within a specific area of the Cascade foothills, preferably with a view of the mountains and significant acreage as buffer from neighbors. Most retirees are looking to be closer to medical facilities. "Mr. Reynolds," she'd commented. Mason had simply smiled. "I've had enough of doctors lately." The property he eventually purchased sat on 40 acres of woodland, bordering national forest on two sides. The cabin itself was modest but solid, a retired forest ranger's former home, with solar panels and a reliable well. Most importantly, it was positioned precisely where Mason wanted, at the edge of what he now knew was seasonal Bigfoot territory. A 3-day hike from the meeting location the elder chief had specified, Emily helped him move in, her concern gradually giving way to understanding as she witnessed her father's contentment in his new home. "You're different since the accident," she observed. One evening, as they sat on the cabin's wide porch, watching the sunset paint the distant peaks in gold and crimson, Mason turned the carved wooden figure in his hands, a small representation of a Bigfoot he'd been working on for weeks, refining the details with patient precision. "Different how?" "Calmer. More." She searched for the right word. "Centered, maybe. Like you found something up there besides a cave to shelter in." Mason smiled, carefully setting the carving on the small table between them. "Maybe I did." Emily didn't press further. Clara's daughter had inherited her mother's wisdom about when to ask questions and when to simply accept. Instead, she handed him an envelope, documents transferring his old house to her name as they'd agreed. Mason would keep his remote cabin. Emily's family would have the suburban home, closer to Lily's school and activities. As spring warmed into summer, Mason established new rhythms. To the outside world, he appeared to be a typical, if somewhat reclusive, wildlife photographer enjoying retirement. His occasional submissions to nature magazines, carefully edited to exclude any hint of his special knowledge, provided modest income to supplement his pension. But Mason's true work happened away from human eyes. He meticulously mapped the surrounding wilderness, noting common hiking routes and unofficial trails. When a university research team announced plans to conduct a biological survey that would take them dangerously close to known Bigfoot travel corridors, Mason volunteered as a local guide, subtly redirecting their efforts to less sensitive areas. He became known to local hikers and rangers as an eccentric but knowledgeable old-timer, always willing to share advice on the safest routes and best photography spots. No one questioned why his recommendations consistently steered people away from certain valleys and ridgelines. His reputation as the mountain miracle man lent weight to his suggestions. If anyone knew which areas were truly dangerous, surely it was him. In his cabin's small office, Mason maintained his private records. The journal documenting Bigfoot language and customs remained locked in a fireproof safe. The photographs showing his hosts were encrypted on a hard drive that never connected to the internet. The plaster cast of the footprint, his first piece of evidence, was hidden beneath a false bottom in a storage chest. Knowledge that would revolutionize science, potentially earn him millions, and certainly secure his place in history, all deliberately withheld. 7 moon cycles had passed. 3 remained until the appointed meeting. Mason checked his calendar daily, though the date was engraved in his memory. In preparation, he had begun acclimating to longer wilderness stays, carefully extending his hiking range and endurance. On a warm summer evening, as Mason sat on his porch, watching fireflies rise from the meadow grass, an unexpected visitor arrived. Chuck Dawson, the ranger who had coordinated his rescue, pulled up in his forestry service truck. "Hope you don't mind me dropping by," Chuck called as he approached. "Was doing rounds nearby and thought I'd check how you're settling in." Mason welcomed him with genuine warmth. Chuck was good people, dedicated to the wilderness and its protection. They shared coffee as twilight deepened around them. "Something I've been meaning to ask you," Chuck said eventually. "Those illegal loggers we caught last winter up near Crest Valley? The anonymous tip that led us to them was mighty detailed. Location, access routes, types of traps they'd set." Mason sipped his coffee, expression neutral. "Good for whoever reported them." Chuck studied him thoughtfully. "Report came in right around when you were found. Caller wouldn't leave a name, but had a voice that reminded me of someone." "Lots of people care about these mountains," Mason replied evenly. "True enough." Chuck finished his coffee and stood to leave. At the steps, he paused. "Funny thing about that valley. Local tribes have stories about it going back centuries. Say it's protected by forest giants who guard the old ways." He shrugged. "Just legends, of course." "Of course," Mason agreed, the pendant warm against his chest. After Chuck departed, Mason remained on the porch until stars filled the night sky. He held the small wooden Bigfoot carving up against the backdrop of distant mountains, comparing its silhouette to his memories. Not perfect but recognizable, a token of remembrance, a symbol of guardianship, a reminder of a promise that would shape the remainder of his life. In 3 months, he would venture back into the deep wilderness to meet his other family. Until then, and after, he would continue his quiet work, preserving wilderness, redirecting human curiosity, protecting a secret that both burdened and blessed him. Mason Reynolds, once defined by his discoveries, was now defined by what he would never reveal. The irony brought a smile to his weathered face as he watched a shooting star trace a brilliant path across the heavens. Some truths belong to the mountains alone,